eternal life, the future of the planet, aliens, and things like that, whereas adults read murder mysteries. In science fiction books, the first two writers to write openly and honestly about sex were Theodore Sturgeon and Philip Jose Farmer. Farmer's Riverworld series of books opens with everyone who ever lived, 10 billion people, waking up together totally naked. All together in the altogether. Great start. What do you do for a finale? Farmer has written 6 more books in the Riverworld series, and he still hasn't figured out how to end it, which is probably why he's written 6 more books. Once again, it was up to the women to show the boys how it was done. The women science fiction writers are generally divided into 2 camps. Yes, I know there's exceptions. I said generally, don't write a letter. Okay, first of all, there's the, if only men weren't so stupid camp. Well, I'm sorry, ladies, but we are. Ursula K. Le Guin's book, The Left Hand of Darkness, prophesied a future where surgery was so advanced you could change your sex as easily as changing your hair color. In fact, easier, because the roots wouldn't show. In this world, it didn't make sense to be prejudiced against women, because next week you might be one. When North America finally discovered sex, which was around 1960, a lot of science fiction writers tried it. I mean, you know, tried writing about it. Robert Heinlein, who had been the Mr. Straight and Narrow of science fiction for young adults, in 1961, he wrote Stranger in a Strange Land and basically went bananas. And he just got weirder and weirder until he wrote Time Enough for Love, where a guy goes back in time and he becomes his own father, which means he has to sleep with his, I mean, Heinlein's sex it's really uncomfortable. It's embarrassing. It's like watching your grandmother in hot pants flirting with young men. You know what I mean? It's just, ugh. Heinlein should have stuck to what he knew, engineering. And that brings us to James Tiptree Jr. Robert Silverberg wrote that Tiptree wrote in a nice manly style, sort of like Hemingway. A lot of women writers accused Tiptree of being a hopeless male chauvinist. So they were a little embarrassed when they found out that James Tiptree Jr.'s real name was Alice Sheldon. She was using a pseudonym because she's from a fairly well-known and well-off Washington family, and she was writing some rather explicit stuff in her stories. The men in her stories, the best of the men, are those idealized, thoughtful men that most women only dream of, and most men already think they are. And finally, I should mention John Norman, The Mercenaries of Gore, and all the other books in the series. S&M-SF, you know, women being whipped and stuff like that. And poor John can't understand why everybody in the science fiction community hates his guts. These books used to be Dawes' biggest selling titles, but not anymore, which shows maybe there is some hope for humanity. Disney Studios has a new film out, The Little Mermaid, based on the Hans Christian Andersen story. It's a love story, and it's a fish story. You should see the one that got away. In the golden days of Disney animation, the music was written before the animating began so they could draw to the music, and that was done again with The Little Mermaid. That way, everything is perfectly in sync.
First, we got to feel...
Wilshire Kitchen Sink Press. This is our 20th anniversary. I think Melody is a fascinating comic. First of all, I like autobiographies. And I think that the culture that she comes from, Sylvie describes in fascinating detail. The whole subculture of strippers, I think, is fascinating. And I've never seen a book written from a stripper's perspective, and certainly never in a comic book form. And it's been a very popular one. Maybe not surprising to some, women find it a very fascinating comic.
Présentement, je fais plus de bande dessinée. Je fais juste les scénarios pour Christian. Puis j'espère que ça va continuer loin. Je suis rendue à 31 livres d'écrits. Ça s'appelle Mélodie, c'est l'histoire d'une danseuse nue. J'ai dansé pendant 10 ans. Puis aujourd'hui, j'en suis très fière. Puis c'est une expérience qu'elle serait facile à vivre pour des filles, mais pas tout le monde.
My name is Jacques Boivin, and I draw the comic book Melody. I'm a comic book artist. Melody is based on the real-life adventures of Sylvie Rancourt. She's basically transcribing into a form that can be told in comic book format the story of her life, which includes her upbringing in Abitibi, the northwestern Quebec area, and her move to Montreal, and how monetary problems brought her to become a nude dancer. It was for her, as she tells me, a personal release, originally not intended for publication. This was the natural way for her to tell her story, tell the things that happened to her. The book is doing very well through Kitchen Sink, and I think we're going to continue on this project. I think it's a very worthwhile project, And the artwork, of course, is the most time-consuming aspect of the chore, so that right now we're only up to issue 4. We've already have assured success, but Sylvie is up to issue 31.
My name's Harvey Pekar, and I write and publish a comic book called American Splendor. And I'm from Cleveland, Ohio. I'm like the guy, you know, like who sells peanuts in front of the biggest building in town or something. You know, I'm a landmark in Cleveland as a file clerk. American Splendor looks like a comic book, but the content is not typical of, by any means, of comic books. I use frames, you know, or panels, and I, you know, put dialogue in balloons and thoughts in balloons. But it's a realistic comic book. It's autobiographical, and it deals with mundane events that most writers, not only comic book writers, but fiction writers as well, and possibly autobiography writers, consider too mundane to deal with. I think, though, that these events are very significant. I think that accumulations of these events influence a person more than, you know, a traumatic experience here and there. Virtually all comic books involve some degree of fantasy. Mine don't. Also, the kind of drawing that I employ in my books is realistic. People aren't all out of proportion or anything like that, and they're not idealized. They look pretty much the way they are. At least that's what I aim for most of the time. And comic book readers don't like to read about stuff like that. They want to read, comic book readers are primarily interested in comic books because of escapism.
One of Commander Rick's favorite love stories was a subplot in the Avengers series, the Kree Skull War. The Vision, this supposedly heartless android, falls in love with the Scarlet Witch. Interestingly now, John Byrne is taking the Vision back to his android roots, which is upsetting the Scarlet Witch because now the two of them are married. She's married to a heartless, unfeeling robot. Ah, yes, women are gonna love this story.
My name is Bill Sienkiewicz. I'm a commercial artist, an illustrator in the comic book field. The reason I did Straight Toasters was a 180-degree turn away from spandex and exploding neutron stars and things like that. And because of my own interest in psychology or what makes people tick, you know, believing firmly that everyone is normal until you get to know them. And I basically want to do a story about the microcosm instead of the global issue, breaking it down to the family unit, the triangle, the triumvirate of the family. And that basically, as much of a cliche as it is, between the, as the twig is bent, you know, so grows the tree, that's basically what I wanted to approach with this. And that if situations aren't resolved in childhood, they become problems in adulthood. And so I took a lot of that, which I believe is factual, certainly plausible, and put it into a fantasy context.
My name is Mark DeMattis, and I am a writer who, among other things, writes comic books. There's nothing groundbreaking about what I put in Moonshadow. If you picked it up and read it in a novel dealing with human sexuality, well, if you're writing about life, you're going to deal with human sexuality. You know, there's a big uproar in the first issue because there was a scene where Moonshadow was reminiscing about his puberty and when he was masturbating. And it was like, horror, you know? But basically, if you read that in a book, you wouldn't think twice about it. So I'm not saying, I'm going to write about sex in comic books. I'm just writing the way to write any good story. And you're writing about life, you're going to deal with human sexuality. So I do. I think it depends on the comic book in question. I think if we're talking about DC and Marvel superhero comics, the word isn't censorship, the word is intelligent guidelines. I think in this rush to do, quote, mature comics, we've been injecting these allegedly adult ideas into a form that doesn't need them or really can't carry them. When you get into something like a Moonshadow or a Blood or an American Splendor or Love and Rockets, as with any other art form, we should be free to say whatever we want, however the hell we want to say it.
Another big alternative comics is Love and Rockets by the Hernandez brothers. Love and Rockets is what adult comics are all about. Controversial, dangerous, and most of all, really adult.
Love and Rockets is a quarterly magazine It's written and drawn by Jaime and Gilbert Hernandez. I think it's a revolutionary comic in the sense that the Hernandezes are doing something that has never been done in comics before, and after doing it for 7 or 8 years, something that's rarely, if ever, done today, and that is they're doing serious dramatic work in comics form that deals with the same kinds of serious questions that literature does.
It started out where the rockets were just a lot of fun to draw, to stick in there for fun, and but as I got more into the characters, the more the rockets got in the way. And you know, it's just, to me, it's always, the characters always come first. You know, people fall in love, fall out of love, get heartbroken, all that kind of stuff.
What I do in Love and Rockets is a strip, a series called Heartbreak Soup. What it is, it's about a mythical Central American village. And the reason I chose that subject is because at the time, this was in the early 80s, there just wasn't, in mainstream entertainment, as in television, movies, popular books, there just wasn't a positive side to Central America. It's either a place where, you know, just all this horrible, you know, politics was going on, or they were always portrayed as the noble peasant. And I wanted to bring people, the Central American people, as you know, you and I know, almost like, you know, shoving their lives into your face, almost, but hopefully real lives, with, you know, lives that are gray, not black and white. And it was just a challenge because most mainstream comics are genre-oriented, and it was just getting away from the genre trappings, such as, you know, crime stories, you know, horror stories, fantasy stories, to do something that was realistic to an extent. There have always been strips, like comic strips in the papers, that were fairly realistic. Like you can see from the 20s, there was like Gasoline Alley, and even Peanuts, to a bizarre extent, is a realistic strip. I mean, it plays a lot with fantasy, but at the same time, the underlying theme is serious and realistic. So that's what I was trying to do, and there wasn't a lot of that in comic books. A lot of people refer to Love and Rockets as a soap opera, and we're not sure if that's an insult or a compliment. But it's all the different levels and different ways we distort love, in a lot of bad ways and hopefully a lot of good ways.
I'd like to look at it instead of a passing fad. I'd like to look at it more as history, you know, that we're actually talking about a time and portraying it realistically instead of a Hollywood way, or, you know.
There's even a love story in Don Bluth's new animated film, All Dogs Go to Heaven. In this scene, our hero Charlie is romanced by King Gabriel. So now comics are full of romance, and yeah, some of them are full of sex. But it seems like the superheroes, what they really still want is more power. Commander Rick can't help wondering if all of the violence in comics is just sexual frustration. In fact, how much violence in the real world is just sexual frustration? Maybe all of it. Make love, not war. It's hard to do both without shooting off your foot. I'm running out of power up here. I can't hold the connection for much longer. Listen, if you get a chance, drop me a line, a letter, or better still, videotape, film yourself, do something. Even, you know, scratch yourself in a series of rocks and flash them at me. I don't care what, but communicate with me. Get in touch. The long distance feels... Greetings, prisoners of gravity. This is Commander Rick on board Reality One, interrupting your regularly scheduled candy floss to stimulate your neurons. You've got it. Let's use it. The Bear is the latest film from French director Jean-Jacques Annaud. In his previous 1981 film, Quest for Fire, he followed a group of prehistoric people as they went on a quest for fire. And the dialogue in the film was all languages invented by Anthony Burgess, who you know as the author of Clockwork Orange. In his new film, The Bear, Annaud does have some English dialogue, but in a 2-hour film, only about 8 minutes worth, something like 600-700 words. Only this time we'll watch it as it was being
bottle from 1931. It's French. It has no copyright on it, so it was unauthorized, but a lot of that stuff was done in the early 30s, and it actually has the most charm. I think this item really represents a very early Mickey Mouse piece. It has that real rat-like look to him. The head is solid glass, and the body is a hollow perfume bottle. And after almost 60 years, it still has perfume in it. My name's Anthony Van Bruggen, and I work at Disney. I design Disney merchandise here in Canada, and I love cartoons. Well, I started collecting toys sort of as an offshoot to my work in animation. I started working at Nelvana, and Nelvana paid me reasonably well. And one day I was at Harbourfront and I found a wooden jointed Felix the Cat doll. This is the toy that really started it all for me. This is the first toy that I picked up. It was down at Harbourfront here in Toronto, and it was in a plastic bag and it was all loose. And I took it home and I restrung it, and this started it all for me. This was a wooden jointed Felix the Cat doll. A lot of Felix the Cat stuff was done in the 20s. This one still has its 1925 copyright on it. Interestingly enough, the copyright is to a fellow named Pat Sullivan, who owned the studio that the character was being animated at. However, the character of Felix was created by a fellow named Otto Mesmer, who was never really thanked for creating the character. Here's my favorite cartoon character. This is Popeye. Once again, this is a wood and composition doll, and it was made in 1935. And well, this is one of my personal favorites. Love this one. This is a tin Popeye wind-up. I have very few wind-ups in my collection, but they're a lot of fun. They all have very unusual actions. This one was made in 1935. And the lithography on it is very nice. This type of toy you won't see made anymore because of the type of tin work it is. There are safety standards to be considered now, and this kind of thing wouldn't be made for children anymore. This is a 1940s Superman doll. It was made by the Ideal Company. It's composition and wood. Composition was a sawdust and glue mixed together, and they would put it in a mold, and they created all sorts of characters, lots of Pinocchio items. But this was one of the few Superman items made because the war broke out, and they used all the raw materials for war instead. This is a stuffed Donald Duck doll, and it was made in Knickerbocker by the Knickerbocker Company in 1936. And what's interesting to note about him is he's the long-billed Donald. Long-billed Donald was the first Donald before he got the squatter beak. Now, the nice thing about Donald, and the thing that I really love about the character, is that he hasn't changed at all in the 55 years he's been around. Now the stuff is really tough to find. The market has really dried up. If you want to find things, you really have to go down to the States where the items were originally produced. Sometimes you get lucky.
Marvel Comics has a whole slew of new projects on the boards for 1990. Steve Saffel is a publicist for Marvel Comics, and he has the whole bird's eye lowdown.
Marvel is really doing a broad diversity of projects in 1990 because we feel that there are more and more readers with this broad base of interests. So we're introducing new comic books in the comic book tradition with superheroes and adventure action material. We're also going to be doing a lot more of the graphic novels. We're going to be doing some more entries into the horror field and into the science fiction field to try to meet all of the needs and all of the interests of the different people. A good example is that we're releasing 6 new titles again, as we did last year, that we're going to launch to try to expand upon the superhero universe. Characters like Namor the Submariner, like the Ghost Rider. We have a new Spider-Man title by Canadian artist Todd McFarlane, who's going to debut as the writer of that title as well. It's going to be called, astonishingly enough, Spider-Man. And Todd is going to do tight 6-issue stories that will read almost like a novel, very much like that Kraven the Hunter epic that we did wherein Spider-Man met one of his classic villains, and in doing so sort of redefined the relationship between the two a number of years ago. Mark DeMatteis, who is also here at the convention, was the one who wrote that particular story. Well, Todd is going to do similar tight novel stories. So, you know, with new titles like this, we hope to instill new energy and new excitement about the mainstream comic book field.
Terry Pratchett is the Douglas Adams of fantasy writing, and to me, Douglas Adams is the Terry Pratchett of science fiction writing, and both of them are hilariously funny. Douglas Adams is probably best known as the author of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, a radio play that mutated into an album and then a book and a TV series, and now it's a software package from Infocom. The whole thing follows the adventures of a poor schmuck named Arthur Dent. Of the two writers, Douglas Adams and Terry Pratchett, I think Terry Pratchett's a more sophisticated writer. His hilarious fantasies are set in the Discworld. One of the main characters is the luggage, a trunk with dozens of legs. The cover art from Pratchett's books, done by Josh Kirby, have been collected and published by Bantam Corgi Books. Here's some of the images here. And by the way, Workman Publishing is bringing out Terry's new book, which he co-wrote with Neil Gaiman, the writer on Sandman and Violent Cases. The book's called Good Omen.
My name is Terry Pratchett, no account Britain, perpetrator of the Discworld series, which started in 1985 as a minor fantasy book, and now, to my everlasting astonishment, has made the bestseller lists in the UK for the last 3 titles. It's really just a place where funny plots can happen. I write funny novels which have a kind of fantasy feel to them. I wouldn't say they are fantasy novels, but they're certainly packaged as fantasy novels, and they sell as fantasy novels, and, you know, 1 million readers can't be wrong. But you see, on the Discworld, death exists as a character, you know, the skull, the robe, the size, the body odor, the horse called Binky, you know, the great white horse. And he decides that he's getting on a bit because, after all, he has been alive since the beginning of time. So he takes on an apprentice, a young gangling boy called Mort, which is short for Mortimer, who has to learn how to be Death. And as Mort gradually takes on the role of Death, so Death starts taking the odd evening off because he wants to find out what there is about life that makes humans want to hang on to it so much. Like, he tries drinking and gambling and fishing and going to parties, but somehow he just can't sort of get the hang of enjoying himself. And so the plot unrolls for there. There's all kinds of subplots, and nothing is exactly what it seems, but it all turns out all right in the end. Most of my books do. Incompetent wizards and the luggage. I think it's almost impossible to describe to you what the luggage is. People that have read about the luggage will probably go on at some length. Luggage is a box on legs. It's magic. It has a mind of its own. It follows its owner around. It's very, very loyal. But I suppose the main characters in Sorcery are Nigel the polite barbarian. His battle cry is, excuse me, and he still wears long woolly underwear under the leather barbarian outfit because he promised his mother. And the other major character, I think, is Conina, the barbarian hairdresser. Her father was Cohen the Barbarian, and her mother was a temple dancer, and she has her mother's looks, but unfortunately she has her father's instincts. She wants to be a hairdresser, but if you put a pair of scissors in her hand, she can kill 90 men with it, but she's trying to keep quiet about this because it puts boyfriends off.
It's outrageous. Bugs Bunny turns 50 years old and nobody even so much as bakes him a cake. And now the oldest SF magazine in existence, Amazing Stories, is turning 64 years old and it's going bankrupt, going titles up. And nobody's doing anything about it. Well, some people are talking about reviving it, but don't hold your breath. Heavy Metal, the most widely distributed magazine of adult fantasy and SF in American comics, is being sold off by National Lampoon. Heavy Metal began in 1977 as an American version of the French magazine Metal Hurlant. Metal Hurlant started 2 years before Heavy Metal, and then it died 2 years before Heavy Metal was sold. Remember Classics Illustrated comics? Comics so nice that even your parents would like them. Classics were great pieces of literature that have been turned into comic books. You know, for people who were too lazy to read the Cole's notes. The trouble was, when they turned these great pieces of literature into comic books, they still had to conform to the comic code. They sort of cleaned them up a little. And it was like reading Reader's Digest. Well, now, First Comics are bringing back Classics Illustrated, and they're a lot more adult, which is exactly why kids will love them. Bill Sienkiewicz has done Moby Dick.
The Classics Illustrated project, based, like, loosely, or not so loosely, on the earlier versions of the Classics Illustrated. It's an updated version of them, done by artists and writers whose style and proclivities fit the material. And I think it's a way not so much to usurp the importance of the classics, but to perhaps pay homage and also indoctrinate younger readers and perhaps even older readers as to reading them and showing again that comics are another valuable way, and there's another way that comics can be valuable in approaching classical material. Currently, at the time involved in the project of the Classics Illustrated line is Gahan Wilson, who will be doing adaptation of Edgar Allan Poe's work, and Kyle Baker, who's doing Through the Looking Glass, and Rick Geary, who's doing Great Expectations, and myself on Moby Dick with Dan Chichester. And it will be handled, those four will be coming out in the first opening salvo, so to speak. The reason I chose Moby Dick was because of my own obsession with obsession. Here's a man completely, totally immersed, if you will, I mean, pardon the pun, like, and obsessed with the whale. You know, a man like shorn, like of his soul, basically, with that, like missing parts of his body as a result of this conflict in himself and against this primal entity.
Commander Rick's favorite new comic definitely has to be Paul Chadwick's classic, Concrete. He swam across the ocean, he dug down into the earth. Commander Rick is waiting for him to come up in space and save me, but I'm not holding my breath. And by the way, there's a great interview with Paul Chadwick in issue number 132 of the Comics Journal. Paul has this to say. Listen, drop me a line, a letter, we'll read it on the air. If you want to send me a tape, if it's not sexist, fascist, or racist, I can put it on the air. You can be on the air with Commander Rick and become electrons, just like me, phosphor dots. Listen, keep in touch. And remember, as a great man once said, gravity can be a prison, but it can also be an anchor.
Snoopy's work.
Greetings, prisoners of gravity. This is Commander Rick. Welcome to my home away from home here on board Reality One. I wanted to talk to you this week about UFOs full of LGMs, little green men, you know, aliens. The name Whitley Strieber may be familiar to you from The Wolfen or The Hunger, two of his horror novels which were turned into movies, or maybe he's familiar from War Day, a novel in which he and co-author James Konieczka take a walk across America after World War III, sort of like post-apocalyptic Jack Kerouac. But you probably know Whitley Strieber from Communion. That was his best-selling book, and that's also just been turned into a movie starring Christopher Walken. The story of Communion is that the author is taken aboard a spaceship by little green or blue men and has various things inserted into various parts of his body. But the really strange part about the novel Communion is that it was published as a non-fiction book. Non-fiction. When Strieber wakes up the next morning, he has a sort of just a vague, uneasy feeling that something happened that night, but he can't quite remember what. But over the next little while, he becomes increasingly weird and increasingly paranoid. By December 28th, I was so depressed and in such a state of inner conflict that I sat down and wrote a short story in an effort to explore my emotions. It was the last sustained writing I would do for 7 weeks, and it's the last thing I wrote before these enormous hidden truths began emerging from my unconscious.